You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Yes, indeed. Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku, tonight. Tonight, we're going to read a paper about the resurrection of the warrior tradition in African political culture by Ali A. Mazrui. Before I get into tonight's episode, into tonight's paper, let me remind you guys that this show is a part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. There are other shows on the network that you should be checking out as well.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Make sure to also check out the Queen's Council podcast. The Queen's Council has been putting out content pretty regularly lately. Make sure to check them out as well. Oddly enough, I had a few concurrent viewers, but right now I seem to have none. All the same, I want to thank everyone who has tuned in. I want to thank all of you who have already given me likes on this video. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe. Click the bell to be notified when I am online or I post new content, as well as let other folks know that you listen to the show. Share the content out there, okay? So let's get into it then. The Resurrection of the Warrior Tradition in African Political Culture by Ali A. Mazrui. Increased attention has recently been paid to the phase of quote-unquote primary resistance, when Africa first had to confront Western intrusion. The arguments of scholars like Terence Ranger for Eastern Africa and Michael Crowder for Western Africa identify those early armed challenges by Africans against colonial rule as the very origins of modern nationalism in the continent. By this argument, Tanzania's ruling party and its function as a liberating force has for its ancestry both the Maji and earlier rebellions against German rule from the 1880s onwards. African struggles against colonial rule did not begin with modern political parties and Western-trained intellectuals. What originated in those early, quote-unquote, primary resistors, with their spears poised against Western military technology. I am basically in sympathy with this school of historiography, but with one important difference. While some scholars regard the Nkrumahs and Nyere's of modern Africa as the true heirs of those primary resistors, I believe that it is certain military regimes in independent Africa and the liberation fighters in Southern Africa who really carry the mantle of the original primary resistors. By my calculation, it is General Idi Amin, rather than Dr. Milton Obote, who is the true successor to those early warriors in Bunyoro, Achioli, as well as West Nile, who reach for their spears to strike a blow, however weak, against European imperialism. But the warrior tradition in Africa was not born on the day the white man landed. It's not a technique invented on the spur of the moment to meet a foreign challenge. On the contrary, it was deeply interlinked with the totality of the cultures of most African societies before the white man came. So our study must choose for its point of departure not a famous resistor against European intrusion, but a warrior who did not as yet have to fight the white man as such. I shall start with Shaka as a symbol of the warrior tradition in Africa prior to the large-scale colonization, and then proceed to General Idi Amin as a symbol of the beginning of a new warrior tradition, or perhaps a partial resurrection of what had once been the meeting point between the discipline of combat and the diffuseness of culture in Africa's social experience. Colonialism and Christianity not only demilitarized, but demasculated Africa. Too many Africans, Shaka became, at the most, a symbol of nostalgia rather than a model of current emulation. Much of Africa retreated from the hard virtues of the warrior tradition and embraced instead a set of imported values for the time being. In the chat room, I see Kevin Care42 is here, and he says Stacey Dash is getting her comeuppance. I haven't paid attention to the Stacey Dash story. I mean, to be honest, once I wash my hand of the so-called Stacey Dashes, I'm pretty much done with those folks. But I saw that she apologized for her past comments that she made on Fox News in the past. When you get your come up, when you get knocked down by these white folks, a lot of black folks like to try to crawl back in, and it's the story of black folks that we're too forgiving, right? We will actually let some crying sellout, some crying traitor come back into the mix. So, I mean, that's all I know about Stacey Dash today. I guess I'll look into the story later, but to be honest, it didn't much interest me. Kevin Care42, what is she apologizing for? What did she say on Fox News previously? I forgot that she's apologizing for now. I'll continue to read while you answer that. So yeah, much of Africa retreated from the hard virtues of the warrior tradition and embraced instead a set of imported values for the time being. Let us first explore more fully the key elements of the warrior tradition, and then relate the whole issue to the significance of both Shaka and Amin in African history. So that brings us to the section called the warrior in society. African societies differed in their modes of self-defense and security arrangements, and in their conceptions of rights and duties of the warrior. Right? Bear me 1 second. But certain themes have persisted in cultures within the African continent, which are otherwise very different from each other. This is partly because the concept of the warrior captures some quite fundamental aspects of human organization and human symbolism. Preeminent among the more obvious shared aspects are the links which the warrior has with the idea of adulthood and the concept of manhood. And I think, this is me talking now as a side, I think this is a big problem we have in our society today. I think we mislabel these idiots in the streets as our warrior class. I've heard that said before. I may have even said it before. But it's a mistake to really call those folks our warrior class, because they're only waging war against their own people. And a large part of that, it goes hand in hand with the idea that a lot of these these fools in the streets are really not men. And they don't have a concept of manhood. And those two things go together. If you don't have a concept of manhood, then you would do this type of stuff we see these folks doing out here in the street. Right? You would see, you know, dudes killing dudes over, you know, stepping on someone's shoes or some shit like that. That's a lack of manhood. That's not a toxic masculinity. That's a lack of manhood. Right? Men know how to stand up and reason and talk things out. You know what I'm saying? There's men in this chat room right now. Let me see if the men are going to disagree with me right now. Right? There's men in this chat room. If we have a disagreement face to face, are we going to be quick to blows, or are we going to stand up and reason this thing out? And if blows have to be thrown after, then so be it. But the guys in the streets who some of us would call the warrior class, those are not our warriors. Those are just as much our oppressors as anyone else. Right? So you always have to have that manhood, that sense of, you know, being an adult and not a child running around with your little friends while harming folks out in the streets. Right? There are two fundamental linkages and carry a variety of implications. Adulthood is related to notions of self-reliance. The adult is he who has a capacity to earn his own living and maintain his own homestead. Right? That right there kind of takes out most of these dudes in the streets talking about they're thugs. The adult is he who has a capacity to earn his own living and maintain his own homestead. But adults are sometimes to be differentiated from elders. In this sense, while children are pre-adults, elders are post-adults, no longer at the peak of their physical strength, though hopefully much enhanced in their mental powers. African languages differ in the way they handle the distinction between relatively young adults with warrior duties on the one hand and elders on the other. But even if we use the term adult in its usual sense in the English language to indicate those who are no longer children, the basic point remains that it is from the ranks of adults that full warriors are recruited. Again, that's another knock against the dudes in the streets. A lot of these guys in the streets are kids. Right? They're kids. The basic point remains that it is from the ranks of adults that full warriors are recruited. A man became a warrior when he was presumed to be capable of guarding cattle, or defending land, or collectively fighting to protect the clan. A heavy element of self-reliance was thus built into the concept of warrior because of its link with the concept of adulthood. In many African societies, the process of initiation carried implications of this presumed stage of self-reliance. The generations are separated for a while, notably the young adults from their elders. In this respect, there is sometimes a closer bond between the third generation and the first, between the elders and the children, than there is between the elders and the young adults. Many African societies encourage newly grown boys to live separately in a lodge after puberty. I think I've told you guys this before. When I was growing up back home, the elders really embraced the young kids. Those ages of 10, 10, 12, 13, those ages like that, it was the elders who really, the elder men, who really embraced you and tried to boost your confidence and give you advice. If they saw you running afoul out there, if they saw you doing some stupidness with a girl, they'll straighten you up and tell you, hey, that's not how you handle that, and this, that, and the other. We have lost that. In the chat room, some activity has gone down. NYC Beauty says we need that warrior spirit back. You let these outsiders come into our communities and do whatever they want. This has to stop. Black Excellence says, she said Fox made her the angry black woman. Okay, this is about Stacey Dash. She said Fox made her the black woman, the angry black woman. She was ripping Trump, but agreed with him on his comments about Charlottesville. Okay. She is really broke. The movie she just did, Hollywood, wants nothing to do with it. Fox News is a career killer. NYC Beauty says, as a grown man, I have to talk things out first. And if it is not resolved, I have to agree to disagree and walk away. Kevin K42 says to me, the government freak out when the Black Panthers organize, but do nothing about the street urchins on the corner. These dudes are a cancer. Yeah, and that's exactly right. So these dudes in the streets are doing nonsense day in and day out, and cops don't really do too much beyond the routine. But the Panthers, who understood those laws and were organized enough to know how to handle themselves with open carry weapons, etc., those guys went in on them. All right? NYC Beauty says, when I go to Jamaica Queens by the subway station, there are these urchins selling fake weed, gambling, trying to talk to women. What's funny is that there are cops nearby and they know what they're doing, or would harass common black folks. Yeah, because these guys are kind of allowed to do the nonsense for a while. Then when the populations in the prisons need to be topped off a little bit, they'll grab a couple of them off the street and throw them in there. But for the most part, they understand that these guys are the guys who are the interface of oppression in black society. That's who we see. It's like what Malcolm X said. They'll go and get a black guy to kill you just to say that it was one of your own who did it. So they let these guys be out here and do the foolishness out here, right? But the thing that's, to bring it to this topic of today, that we got to understand is we got to stop thinking of these folks, right? We got to stop glorifying the streets and whatnot and thinking that these folks in the streets are our warrior class. The reality of the matter is these guys are do-nothings, right? They're in the streets. You're already doing this, that, and the other street behavior, and you won't bust a grape towards one of these folks who kill, one of our children, one of our unarmed citizens, right? I'm talking about, by citizens, I mean members of the black community, right? These guys don't do nothing. George Zimmerman is out here walking up and down. Meanwhile, you got rappers in the state where Zimmerman is, right? Running each other down, shooting them, shooting folks in the street, killing them, issuing threats, between themselves. It's just nonsense. To continue. The removal of the boy, so this follows from the last sentence that says, many African societies encourage newly groomed boys to live separately in a lodge after puberty. The removal of the boy from parental care is a matter of separation of the generations. Boy is developing into a man. A new generation has come into being within the family. This is on an individual level. Seclusion of the whole group of initiants in their own lodge and their reluctance to give the fathers, for example, the parental generation, access to the lodge also points to the separation of adjacent generations, but on a group level. The oneness of the circumcised in the lodge would seem to express the solidarity of a new adult generation. The gulf between the generations produces its own tensions. Kirsten Alnez tells us about Konzo fathers who are reluctant to have their sons circumcised too soon because the ceremony converts them in some ways into rivals. Indeed, a boy eager to cross the line into adulthood might in desperation approach a Muslim to be circumcised without going through the traditional Konzo ritual. But this is the last resort. A fair number of boys ran away to be circumcised in the traditional manner, and they usually manage to have the operation before the father arrives on the scene. Traditional circumcision is a symbolic transition from childhood to manhood. It takes a special type of dude. Like, how many of you guys in the chat room at the age of 13 would want to have a circumcision? Man. Other African societies have more complex stages of social progression. The Nandi of Kenya have seven age grades, each with a name of its own, and all operating on the basis of a recurring cycle. Every 15 years, the fighting age hands over to the grade next below it, and members of that succeeding age would have been preparing themselves during the previous 15 years to qualify for warriorhood after circumcision. The retiring age moves up to become elders. The theme of mature independence again links adulthood with warriorhood. The initiation ceremonies, both those involving circumcision and those which do not share certain important characteristics. The descriptive literature has been summarized by S.N. Eisenstand, but I wish to relate this more explicitly to the theme of self-reliance and mature independence, which initiation implies for the pre-adult adolescent. Number one, they are formed through a series of rites into full adult members of the tribe. Number two, they are symbolically divested of the characteristics of youth and invested with those of adulthood from a sexual and social point of view. This has deep emotional significance, especially when accompanied by bodily mutilation, circumcision, and a new name. Three, they're completely separated from the world of their youth, and especially from their close attachment to their mothers. For example, their complete male independence and autonomous adult image are articulated. The opposite usually holds true for girls' initiation. Number four, their encounter with the new generation is dramatized in the form of a fight or competition, in which the basic complementariness, whether of a continuous or discontinuous type, is stressed. Thus, in all initiation rites, the members of different generations must act together as teachers or as students. The elders sometimes assume frightening forms and stress that without them, the adolescents cannot become adults. Quite often, the discontinuity between adolescence and adulthood is symbolically expressed in their death as children and rebirth as adults. Communities in Africa which have had age-set systems have usually related them closely to their military organization. But even among the newer, where the age-set system is less directly militaristic, the link between adulthood, manhood, and warrior remains explicit. In Einstein's words, when a boy passes into the grade of manhood, his domestic duties and privileges are radically altered. From being everyone's servant and an inferior, he becomes an independent adult. Change of status is epitomized in the taboo on milking, through which he becomes separated from women. With whom he has identified as a boy. A taboo which begins at his initiation and remains in effect throughout his life. At initiation, the youth receives a spear from his father or uncle and becomes a warrior. He becomes a true man when he has fought in war or battle, has not run away, has dueled with his age mate, has cultivated his garden, and has married. Has dueled, with his age mate, has cultivated his garden, and has married. I hope to demonstrate that the theme of self-reliance involved in this warrior tradition is antithetical to the dependency complex which many Africans later acquired under the impact of colonial rule. I hope also to illustrate that the struggle against dependency, as exemplified by General Idi Amin at his best, in an important sense, a reactivation of the ancestral assertiveness of warrior culture. What should not be overlooked is the sexual dimensions of the warrior culture. As already indicated, an initiation ceremony was simultaneously a moment of confirmation as an adult and graduation as a man. Adulthood and manhood were sometimes indistinguishable for the male line of the tribe, but there's also a primeval link between manhood and warriorhood. Societies otherwise vastly different from each other, one factor remains constant. It was a man who fought for the society on the battlefield. Virtues like courage, endurance, even ruthlessness were regarded as hard masculine virtues. The statement, quote unquote, he is a real man, could mean either he is a sexually virile or he is tough and valiant. Virility and valor were interlinked as masculine attributes. And what we have is kids out here pretending to be warriors, right? Doing, you know, showing displaying optics that would make you think that they were men about their business, when really they're just guys, you know, kids out here, you know, getting chicks pregnant left and right, but not really tending to his garden. In the chat room, NYC Beauty says, one time I came from Philly, it must have been 4 a.m. and these urchins are playing dice. I think they work with law enforcement. Tariq loves to big up these urchins. Shout out FBA. Ouch. Kevin Care42 comes in and says, when the protests at the Red Apple Nail Salon happened, I came across some street dudes. We had a conversation. What was interesting was that these dudes call themselves warriors. And I asked one of them why they let some Asians beat up their women. They told me they were cool with the Chinese restaurant owner. I suspect that owner was giving them food. I walked away disgusted. Woof. I mean, Kevin K42 is telling his story. That's one story, but I'm sure if you walked out in these streets, you'll find many similar stories. Now, some people will say, well, screw them, F them, forget them, leave them behind. Again, if we said that about every black person that deviates from, from what we are, there'll be about the 6 of us who are on this live stream right now. 6, 7 of us on this live stream. That'll be it. Black Excellence says being a warrior is not just valor in battle, but valor of the mind. A lot of times these things interconnect in such a way that you don't really realize it all the time. Like, honestly, if you are a man about tending to his garden, for example, right? Making a way. You have your lady, you have your kids. You have to be willing to fight. You got to be willing to protect them. You have to have some valor, right? And if the woman that you're dealing with is paying attention, she'll only choose you if you have some valor, right? And so, all of these things go together, We have to keep those things in mind. To continue, some African societies, special sexual rights were accorded to warriors. Among the Nandi, they enjoy considerable sexual privileges, especially legitimate access to uninitiated girls who could thus be adopted as sweethearts. I think I read about some of this in recent weeks. A warrior did not have to marry a sweetheart, but could continue keeping her in that role even after he had married someone else, provided he also remained within the warrior set. So when you see, again, I'm talking about the streets. You could play this with street dudes and they can get as mad as they want to get. I don't care. If you're one of these folks who are bigging up the streets all the time, like Tariq and them, as NYC Beauty is pointing out inside the chat room, right? These street dudes are living false pretenders to being warriors, because all these street dudes have their sweethearts and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not out here as the morality police, right? But do they earn those privileges? I don't know about you, but if I have people who are protecting me and mine, you get some privilege, right, for doing that. Maybe I pay you a little bit more, give you a bonus or whatever. That's how we need to be dealing with folks in our society. You can't date a woman out here in our society now, and, you know, because why? She's a part of a throuple to some dusty dude? Yeah, I'm talking about dusty dudes again, I know. Believe me, that's happening way more than you think. I think it was only to say from the pro-black perspective. Shout out to him. I think it was him in one of my live streams who was saying something like, the reason why you see on dating apps and stuff women talking about not trying to be a third is because it happens so frequently. It's a real thing out here. And when I observe it, I don't see upstanding men getting these privileges. All I see is dusty dudes getting these privileges. And folks want to call that our warrior class. Nah. To continue. Upon retirement from warriorhood, the men had to limit themselves to their wives. You see? There's something that actually makes sense. You're out here being a warrior, you get certain perks. Okay, you're retired now? Those perks are done. It was partly because of this that problems sometimes arose at the time when a warrior was due to relinquish his status within the fighting grade and move up to the level of elder. Many a warrior among the Nandi was reluctant to be so promoted if this reduces sexual privileges. Well, that, again, that's the human sucker shit that comes up sometimes, but it is what it is. As we shall see later, there are African cultures which demand on the part of the warrior sexual abstinence rather than accord them sexual privileges. But even where such patience is demanded, the assumption is that the promise of later sexual advantage will help increase current marital commitment. The knight or crusader is promised a sexual paradise when the fighting is over. And I'm not mad at that. I'm not mad at that at all. Brings us to a section of the paper called The Mystique of Violence. Hey guys, if you're listening live right now, I know sometimes folks like to listen quietly in the back, be quiet in the background and on the chat room and whatnot. But if you're here and you're listening, it'll be cool for you to, even if it's just to type the number 1 in the chat. Let me know that you're here listening. Let me see who all is here at the end of the day. If you're new here, make sure to click the like, hit subscribe, and click the bell so you can be notified when I'm on again or I upload new content. All right. Let's get to this section of the paper, the mystique of violence. Because manhood was thus linked not only to sexual virility, but also to valor and war, violence itself became in some sense a masculine attribute. Capacity to take ruthless decisions or inflict brutal damage when this was required became associated with hard-headed manliness. Right? So I saw only to say on Twitter made a tweet along the lines of men deal with women because they're stronger than women, and so they feel safe with women, whereas women aren't as strong as men, so they fear them. And the whole gist of it was stop complaining as a man that a woman doesn't trust you immediately. She shouldn't, and the reason is because she understands and may have even gone through some of the brutality that is man, right? That men can physically bring, and I understand and I agree with that. I do also agree with something that's said here. To me, that's key. Real men have the capacity to be ruthless, have the capacity to inflict brutal damage. But the key word in this that follows right here is as it's required. Now, a woman might know if you're a real man or not, and so I get it. But I'd like women to understand that the man that you want to choose is not the guy who's always out here making noise and in skirmishes and dust-ups all the time. That's not the real dude. The real man is the man who sits down. In fact, as my grandfather would say, a real man is a thinking man. A real man sits down and thinks it out, right? And when he's gone through all the checkoffs, and he realized that the only choice left is violence, and violence it is. And that's who you need to be choosing. Choose the men who understand when something is required. This kind of equation is not, of course, uniquely African. Western culture to the present day allocates fighting roles disproportionately to men. Those who dropped bombs from B-52 planes in Vietnam were American men. The thousands who were sent to the front lines throughout Indochina from the United States were overwhelmingly men. Those who died in distant lands for what American presidents regarding as their natural interests, as well as those who were taken prisoner and spent years in bondage and deprivation away from their homes, were again men. But in addition, there were those who committed acts of brutality against the enemy in Indochina, or authorized the destruction of villages, or facilitated the ruin of vegetation and food supplies for peasants, and found themselves vindicated by a sense of ruthless manliness in conditions of war. In African history, the equation became between masculinity and warriorhood sometimes links matrimonial eligibility with marital prowess. There were African societies where a man could not marry unless he proved himself either in a major hunting exercise or in a major battle. The idea of either killing a lion or killing brave warriors from another tribe as part of the process of qualifying for the role of husband survived in some African societies into the 20th century. Bravery itself was sometimes defined as capacity for ruthless actions when this was necessary. Chinua Achebe captured some elements of this theme in his first novel, Things Fall Apart. I just was thinking about that as I was reading. Right? Okonkwo, the leading character, is above all fearful of being mistaken as weak. His father had been a relatively weak man, in some ways lazy, and Okonkwo's main ambition in life was a perpetual quest for vindication as a brave man. He was in fact brave, but in addition he imposed on himself a sense of eternal vigilance against even momentary weakness. And circumstances demanded that his adopted son, Ikemefuna, should die because the tribal oracle had so decreed. He not only permitted that ritual killing to take place, but even participated in it. Okonkwo loved the boy, and above all would have wished to see him live. But if the ancestors wanted his death, then the community had to kill him. Okonkwo was determined not to betray his affection for the boy, lest it be mistaken for weakness. Thus he killed someone he loved out of fear of being mistaken for a coward. Given the link between manliness and warfare, there could also be an easy link between violence and sexuality. A man taunted as weak in a sexual sense could seek vindication in marital prowess. In this regard, the story of Shaka emerges as profoundly symbolic. Shaka created the Zulu state at its most powerful. He took over the Dingiswayo, who ruled from 1808 to 1818, and laid the foundation of the new kingdom. Shaka's own period of power overlapped with that of Dingiswayo, taking partial control in 1816, consolidating in 1818, and expanding from then onwards until 1828 when he was assassinated. Among the rulers of this remarkable kingdom, Shaka has remained a powerful memory. Shaka stands out as the greatest of them all, both Romulus and Napoleon, to the Zulu people, and his legend has captured the imagination of both European and African writers, aspiring novels, biographies, and historical studies in several tongues. As a violent autocrat, he is both admired and condemned. Admired by those who love conquerors, condemned by those who hate despots. Shaka's capacity for brutality remains one of the wonders of world history. He liquidated his enemies with remarkable vengeance, at the same time integrating others into a new Zulu empire. Communities not previously designated as Zulu became eligible for assimilation, while some recalcitrants were annihilated. European observers of Shaka's behavior sometimes overstated his brutality, but even allowing for that exaggeration, there was indeed a substantial degree of wanton violence and cruelty. Time and again, for no discernible reason, Shaka, with a flick of his hand and no further attention, ordered the execution of some member of his entourage. It was a phenomenon that was noted on every occasion on which a European paid a visit to the royal corral. And despite the initial impression that Shaka merely wished to impress his visitors with his absolute power, it gradually sank in that the executions were a normal part of Zulu court life. And that Shaka gave us little heed to the impression left on his visitors, as he did that he made on their victims or their families. Power was indeed absolute, and it had reached the ultimate corruption. In the chat room, I see that NYC Beauties has said to me, many dudes today are too emotional. They are physically men, but a boy's mind. Back in the 80s, when I was a kid, I got into fights. Some I won, some I lost. But after these, I guess NYC Beauties is saying, but after those, everything was cool. You fought, you won, you lost, everything was cool. Modern interpretations of Shaka's mentality have inevitably sought some indications in his childhood. Psychological approach towards understanding Shaka has turned the attention of scholars and other writers to the formative period of this great African ruler. what made him so cruel while at the same time so courageous and daring. Zulu boys at that time went completely naked until they were initiated. Legend has it that one day when Shaka was 11 years old, two herd boys flung the historic insult at him. Look at his pants. It is just like a little earthworm. Ooh, oh, sorry, look at his penis. It is just like a little earthworm. Yeah, that'll make you a bad boy when you grow up. Shaka was enraged. He was now becoming increasingly conscious of the stumpiness of his genital organ. By the way, I've never heard this. He flung himself at the two boys who had insulted him, and his pure fury and the element of surprise enabled him to inflict savage bruises and injuries on his two tormentors. The inadequacy of his sexual equipment, at least at that stage of the boy's growth, became a major factor in the shaping of Shaka's personality. He began to brood deeply over this deficiency, which, as all herd boys paraded in the nude up to the age of puberty, was so painfully apparent. Nothing could be more humiliating to a Zulu than this. It led to a feeling of hopeless inferiority and deep resentful brooding from which may well have derived that need to dominate first his family, then his tribe, at last a vast empire. As to whether Shaka's sexual organ later changed enough physically to be regarded as normal, this paper does kind of go weird, right? One version has it that by the time he was initiated, only a few years after the first taunts, he was unwilling to cover it, even after the ceremonial rites of puberty. He wished it to be known that he was now physically adequate. But other versions maintain that the stumpiness of his organ continued, affected important aspects of his behavior. By the time he became an all-powerful emperor, he still insisted on having his bath on open ground in the presence of his entourage. Hate that. Hold on. Give me a second. I discussed earlier the role of initiation rites as confirmation of adulthood, manhood, and eligibility for warriorhood. Shaka is credited with having made some important changes in the initiation customs of the Zulu. One version credits him with having abolished circumcision, so the practice continues among other members of the Nguni family of tribes. But another version says that the changes had begun just before Shaka assumed authority and power among the Zulu, and that they were deemed necessary for military reasons. Circumcision among the Nguni, though important as preparation for warriorhood, was nevertheless temporarily followed by a period of seclusion of a new initiate. In the words of J.D. Omer Cooper, quote, "The circumcision ceremonies, the subsequent period of ritual seclusion, which deprived the tribe of part of its fighting strength for considerable periods and left the initiates very vulnerable in case of war, were abandoned in response to conditions of more frequent fighting. At the same time, tribal armies were reorganized on an age grade basis." Some records ascribe the change in circumcision ceremonies to an order by Dingiswayo that these be postponed until his conquests were complete. This was the chief who gave Shaka some of the earliest opportunities and who was later succeeded by him as supreme ruler. On balance, it seems almost certain that the actual abolition of circumcision among the Zulu came under Shaka's leadership. Again, issues of manhood interacted with issues of warriorhood. Ceremony concerning the male organ became linked to military strategy. Some have even attributed Shaka's adoption of the short stabbing spear, or asejai, not only to military ingenuity, but also to considerations of symbolic male sexuality. Whatever the actual facts concerning Shaka's life and priorities, there is little doubt that in him we have a supreme example of the interaction between issues of manhood and warriorhood, a link between a sense of sexual inadequacy and a policy of brutal assertiveness. In Shaka, the warrior tradition, as a fusion of virility and valor, lacked an adequate balance. Yet in that very distortion, the message of such a fusion became dramatized. A related factor among the policies of Shaka was the principle of celibacy, which he introduced for adoption by his warriors for as long as they were active. In this sense, we might distinguish between two senses of manliness in relation to sex: virile promiscuity and sexual discipline. In the one case, a man is he who can cope with either a number of women or a highly charged single woman. Capacity to perform well in sex becomes part of the very definition of virility. The other sense of manliness regards a lot of sexual activity as being itself a form of weakness. The promiscuous male becomes a playboy without the will to stop amusing himself with women. The warrior proves his manhood by renouncing for a while his sexual desires, concentrating instead on issues of courage, endurance, and discipline. You see boxers do that, right? Boxers tend not to engage in sexual activity before a big fight. And we've actually heard of boxers who broke it, right? Did a bunch of shenanigans with some ladies and lost the fight. Shaka adopted the second sense of masculinity as the basis of his code for his warriors. He not only forbade his men to marry, but also to have sexual relations at all with women until he gave them permission to do so upon retirement from active military service. If you were a man in Shaka's army, how long could you serve? That's my question to the fellas in the chat room. How long could you serve under this, with these rules in mind? How long could you serve in Shaka's army? There are tribes which forbid warrior marriage, while giving them considerable license in extramarital sexual relations. As mentioned earlier, the Nandi sometimes adopted matrimonial celibacy for their warriors, without sexual abstinence. But Shaka imposed on his warriors both forms of celibacy. As a Sotho writer put it, the reader must remember that above all else on earth, the black races love to marry. Well, isn't there a truth to that? Often in speaking of the good things of life, people do not mention marriage, because marriage is life. Therefore, we can understand well how hard the warriors of Shaka worked to gain his reward. To set his regiments an example, Shaka remained a bachelor till the end of his life. This is the most important thing that Shaka did. Shaka's adoption of this sense of manliness had its military rewards. Promise of a sexual paradise later on encouraged discipline while maintaining hope for the future. Nor was celibacy, even in the sense of total sexual abstinence, unknown among African societies in times of combat. What Shaka did was to distort this general principle and carry it to a bizarre excesses. Shaka sometimes deliberately tested his warriors, stripped in drill formations, and then exposed to the sight of naked maidens dancing before them. Those who showed any signs of sexual excitement were ruthlessly punished. Man, I'll be getting my ass beat. I probably would last about 3 days in Shaka's army. I'll be retired after 3 days, right? When his mother died, he forbade for a while all intercourse in the kingdom, and once tested his troops with maidens on pain of death at the slightest sign of genital erection. Shaka's gaze, he needed to lift his eyes a little higher. Right? It is because of this and other excesses that scholars like Max Gluckman have concluded that Shaka was at least a latent homosexual, possibly psychotic. Here we go with the homosexual talk, but I gotta say, Shaka, take your eyes off these dudes, man. Come on. We see then, once again in Shaka, a distortion of a discipline which in other African societies legitimately forms part of the warrior tradition. We need to exercise sexual self-discipline. We need to exercise sexual self-discipline. The need to exercise sexual self-discipline becomes converted into a demand not to have sexual feelings at all. The value of the discipline would normally have arisen out of the very ability to conquer temptation. But Shaka would not even permit the right to be tempted, let alone the privilege of satisfying that temptation. In the chat room, I see some activity. Black Excellence says, my comments are not showing up. Okay, just showed up. YouTube is at it again. NYC Beauty says to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Black Excellence goes on to say, that much time without sex and all wars is not good. Yeah, I mean, what do they call it in the army? Is it R&R? I think it's R&R, rest and relaxation. Right? You can't be fighting all the time. You can't be fighting all the time. As a man, you can't be fighting all the time and no release. Nah. No. Won't work. To continue the paper. Yet sexual celibacy does provide an important link between Shaka and the Mau Mau movement in Kenya during the 1950s. This rebellion against British rule and white settler occupation of African land constituted the first major resurrection of the warrior tradition in recent East African history. The Kikuyu mobilized themselves into armed rebellion against European settlerdom. The fighters in the Aberdare hills and forests became for a while the true heirs of that heritage of primary resistance. The Kikuyu went back to reactive primeval symbolism and to resurrect important elements of traditional virtues as a basis for establishing a military solidarity against the colonial presence in Kenya. You know, as I'm reading this and stumbling over some of the words, I watched a quote-unquote debate the other day. I posted on the Discord and I added everyone, so you guys should have seen the post and been able to check it out. I know KW Dawn and Onita Say commented about it. And this dude, one of the dudes called himself Supreme something. And he was reading this blog post. And, you know, small children could read that blog post better than he did, right? And so when I'm stumbling here, I'm laughing to myself because I'm reminded of what that guy superior did in that debate. You guys on the Discord, go ahead and check it out. It's on the Discord. I added everyone. It's entertaining. There's some problems with both arguments, from both sides. Both sides can be problematic, but it's something you should definitely check out. The connection between martial and sexual symbolism remains a major aspect of the various oaths of allegiance demanded from the Mau Mau. I have details of the Batuni oath. The initiate was first stripped naked and seated facing the oath administrator. A long strip of goat's meat was placed around his neck, across his chest, and down his back, around his waist several times, and then between his legs. The new warrior was ordered to hold this end of the goat's meat up against his penis. On the other floor were the two eyes of an uncastrated he-goat, or kihi. The word itself means uncircumcised youth, but was paradoxically used during the Malma insurrection to refer to a man who had taken the Batuni oath. The oath itself did not demand total sexual abstinence, but forbade the use of prostitutes and the seduction of other men's women. This reduced the danger of betrayal by temporary sexual companions, such as prostitutes, and was designed to discourage the warriors from quarreling with each other over women. And you know, I made this point recently, and I made it in the past. This is why, like, the whole Ten Commandments story of a being in a burning bush given these commandments are just, you know, just a sensationalized story, right? Because you don't need some supreme being in a burning bush to tell you, hey, maybe you don't mess with another warrior, you know, another man's wife. Because we don't want, you know, quarreling with people over a woman, right? That could potentially turn into some brutality and death and all this kind of stuff. So how about we just abide by this rule, right? Stay away from any man's woman. You know, that doesn't require a supreme being, but if they want to scare you into it, right, that's what they give you. Yet once the Malma fighters were in the forest, total sexual abstinence was demanded among some groups, and in certain detention camps where the possibility of having intercourse with women was possible, sexual codes were self-imposed by the detainees against sexual relationships, while they were all behind bars. But in general, while the Malma movement used aspects of that old discipline, which Shaka had demanded of his own warriors, it did not push this to total extremes. There were other instances in the organization of Mau Mau linking sexual with martial symbolism, including the use of menstrual blood for certain oath-taking ceremonies. Here was an attempt to provide a sense of sacred awe to counterbalance belief in the invincibility of the white man, which the colonial experience had so far consolidated. Let us remind ourselves that the warrior tradition earlier in the century had been badly damaged by two terrors which had come with the white man: gunfire and hellfire. The fear of gunfire was what the new military technology of the white man was all about. Those early primary resistors against a European intrusion discovered before long the overwhelming superiority of the cannon as against spear, the gun as against the bow and arrow. In the words of the English writer Hilaire Belloc, quote, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not." European technology soon overrode and demoralized the resistors. The new terror of gunfire initiated the decline in the warrior tradition. Isn't that funny? Because it's really the gunfire that has a decline in warriors in black society right now. Because of the gunfire, the back and forth killings and all this stuff, has a decline in true warriors right now. The decline was reinforced by the terror of hellfire, which came with Christianity. Death for millions of Africans was now given a new meaning. African ancestors were cut down to size. denounced as insignificant by the missionaries of the new religious order. A new God was proclaimed and a new fear of damnation was propounded. Some African Christians, like many other Christians before them, accepted the concept of hellfire at its face value. Others equated it simply with the threat of damnation after death. Whatever interpretation, literal or symbolic, the new religion had come with a new system of punishment and rewards. Let me read that again. Whatever interpretation, literal or symbolic, the new religion had come with a new system of punishment and rewards. The power of all indigenous belief was endangered. The authority of the village medicine man struggled against the challenge of the local missionary school. The old order partially disintegrated, with it the warrior tradition also. So it became necessary for African resistance movements to invent new forms of ritualized damnation in order to outweigh the combined demasculating effect of the fear of the white man's gunfire and the Christian priest's hellfire. Whew. I want y'all to think about that for a second as I take a... Well, you know what? Let me finish this and then I'll take the commercial break. Christianity had in addition damaged the warrior tradition in Africa by proclaiming the ethic of turning the other cheek. Meekness was regarded as a virtue even for otherwise virile and valiant men. Oh man, let me highlight. Listen, meekness was regarded as a virtue even for otherwise virile and valiant men. A version of Christianity which had hardly ever been truly implemented in Europe, and which had in part become anachronistic on its home ground, was now bequeathed to African school children and peasants. The God of love was mobilized behind the task of, quote, imperial pacification. Message of Christianity discouraged Africans not only from fighting each other, but also from resisting the colonial presence. The Mau Mau movement had to help Kikuyu Christians transcend the conditioning of turning the other cheek, as well as overcome the terror of eternal Christian damnation. The oath, which combined sexual symbolism with militant commitment, helped to counter the demasculating consequences of the colonial experience. The forest fighters were militarily defeated by the British, but this was clearly a victory of the vanquished. The political triumph went to Africans, even if the military successes were retained by the colonialists. The stranglehold of the white settlers was at last broken, and before long, Kenya was preparing for independence. The Mau Mau was the first great African liberation movement of the modern period. All the efforts which are now being made in Southern Africa to consolidate resistance, organize sabotage, and seek to dispel white power and privilege have for their heroic ancestry that band of fighters in the Aberdare forest. The warrior tradition was at least temporarily revived at a critical moment in Kenya's history. This brings us to the section of the paper that deals with Idi Amin, called Amin, the quest for adulthood. I'm going to take a moment right here. I want to thank you guys for tuning in tonight. I hope you guys continue tuning in as I take this quick station ID break. And on the other side, we'll be back to finish it off.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Make sure you guys check out all of those shows, as well as the Queen's Council podcast on KWAZ Radio. By the way, if you're here and you're listening to this episode either live or on playback, and if you haven't already, make sure to follow KWAZ Radio on YouTube. We want to try to grow that channel's numbers a bit as we start to do some new stuff. You're going to see some new stuff on there starting next week. Also make sure you guys subscribe to KWAZ Radio. Click the bell to be notified when new content is uploaded over there as well. In the chat room, I see we got an appearance by KW Don 7. Never misses to appear. Appreciate you. KW Don 7 says the meek will not inherit the earth. They will inherit genocide. Yep. KW Don, Kevin Care42 says to KW Don 7, I wish many of our people will consider your wise words. The meek will not inherit the earth. They will inherit genocide. Okay? So we move on to this next part of the paper called Amin, as in Idi Amin, the quest for adulthood. Among those who fought on the British side in the Mau Mau War was a soldier from Uganda called Idi Amin. He had been recruited into the 4th Battalion of the King's African Rifles in 1946 and showed all the signs of colonial conditioning into dependency. With him, it was the terror of gunfire that promoted his sense of allegiance to the British. Amin learned about hellfire from Islam, but since Uganda was ruled by an imperial power associated with Christianity, and since the whole political culture of the country had already given considerable prestige to Christian values, there was in Idi Amin no sign of a pent-up jihad spirit wishing to break out. He was no different from the bulk of the subdued population of Uganda. In some ways, he seemed even more subservient upon recruitment into his branch of the British Imperial Forces. Within 7 years, he was promoted to Lance Corporal and was displaying the qualities that so endeared him to his British superiors: instant obedience, fierce regimental pride, reverence towards Britain and the British, a uniform which crackled with razor-sharp starches, creases, and boots with toe caps like black mirrors. The colonial experience had indeed undermined the sense of adulthood in Amin and Africa. On the one hand, there was the deep paternalism among even the most liberal of white men in Africa, and the tendency to see Africans as not quite mature. On the other hand, Christian missionaries once again looked upon their responsibilities in Africa virtually in parental terms. Africans were not only amongst the most heathen of God's children, they were in fact only grown-up children. Even a great humanitarian figure like Albert Schweitzer, while conceding that all men were brothers, went on to insist that the white man was the elder brother. The ritualistic language of Christianity in terms of children of God and the whole symbolism of fatherhood in the organizational structure of the Catholic Church, all the way from the concept of Pope to the rank of father among some priests, took on additional significance in African conditions. The metaphor of fatherhood within the Catholic hierarchy reinforced filial tendencies among African converts. Again, the repercussions went beyond the particular members of that denomination and reinforced the dependency complex in the society as a whole. While the indigenous culture encouraged respect for elders, the colonial experience made Africans subservient even to European children. It was almost instinctive to be deferential toward the white skin, whatever the difference in ages between the submissive African and the acknowledging European. When Idi Amin invited the 3 sons of his commanding officer to Sunday lunch, he apparently insisted on collecting them in his car, despite the fact that they lived only 20 yards away. After lunch, he solemnly drove them back again. Jesus. God damn. The tendency to accept indignities was also pronounced and was a clear indication of the deep sense of servitude. Amin was again a child of this servile era. Inevitably, new African officers modeled themselves on the British. But a commission didn't mean an end to the traditional indignities they had suffered for years. The only African member of the Nile Rugby Club, Edie often traveled with the team to play in Kenya. But during the parties after the game, he would be obliged to sit in a vehicle outside the Europeans-only clubhouse. Such blatant discrimination did not prevent him from aping what he believed to be the established social behavior of European officers. The man was clearly not a Shaka. That militant self-confidence of the Zulu despot, though lying latent in Idi Amin, had as yet to be activated. The decline of the warrior tradition had made sycophants, even of perhaps especially of African soldiers, for at least as long as the colonial era persisted. Uganda became independent in October 1962. Little more than 8 years later, Idi Amin became president. At first, the dependency complex, which had characterized his conduct during the colonial period, remained a factor in his behavior after assuming supreme authority. The two most influential foreign missions in Kampala were the British High Commission and the Israeli embassy. Amin reaffirmed his love for the British and demonstrated considerable deference to the Israelis as his benefactors. Britain was in fact the first country to recognize his new regime, and Amin was not in the least embarrassed by this imperial gesture. It was not until 1972 that Amin at last began to assert a sense of adulthood. His first major targets were the local Israelis, who probably helped him to come to power, and who had served him fairly well until then. But it was indeed a dependency relationship while it lasted. Uganda was in some sense a client state of Israel for at least a year. Then Amin decided to assert his independence, and by April 1972 had expelled all the Israelis. By August 1972, he was engaged in a major confrontation with London over the future of British Asians in Uganda. British Asians in Uganda. He gave them 3 months to clear out of the country, to the consternation of Britain and much of the rest of the world. In the face of considerable pressure to reverse his decision, Amin emerged triumphant. What was the movie? Was that a Spike Lee movie? Yeah, isn't that Mississippi Masala or something that it's called? Wasn't there a Spike Lee movie where the story, well, yeah, I think it was, yeah. The story was that the father was relating the story of how they were kicked out of their home in Africa, and claiming that it was the only home they ever knew, and they had to return to India. Do you guys remember that movie that I'm referring to right now? By December 1972, he was confronting the British in connection with their business enterprises in Uganda. He was also trying to assert a new independence on the issue of British advisors and teachers. During 1973, a new challenge of adulthood faced Uganda as a whole. Could it survive the departure of so many foreign businessmen? Could schools maintain themselves in the face of the Asian and European exodus? Would the country discover new economic and professional energies within itself capable of consolidating a new level of nationhood? The future is still uncertain, and the questions have yet to be conclusively answered. Of course, this is an older paper, so that's why it reads that way. Has Amin recovered his adulthood or only his manhood? The theme of masculinity is certainly pertinent here. Whereas Shaka had defended manliness in terms of sexual abstinence, Amin has seen it in terms of virile promiscuity. We should remember the Sotho writer's assertion that above all else on earth, the black races love to marry. Shaka's example did not prove that point. Amin's style lends greater support to it. He himself assumed supreme authority equipped with 4 wives. He has since divorced 3 of these, but the question of new marriage is still open. Again, this is a whole paper. We know Idi Amin is dead. To some extent, he has been making up for the prohibitions of the old colonial days when the British authorities would permit only 1 wife in army barracks. According to a story attributed to Amin himself, a British officer once came to inspect the quarters and saw 2 women in his house. Amin introduced one of the women as his wife. The British officer asked suspiciously, "Who was the other one?" Amin answered that she was my dada, the Swahili word for elder sister. Since Amin assumed supreme authority, he is known officially as President Idi Amin Dada. One story concerning the origins of the title, Dada, is that it goes back specifically to that incident of virile promiscuity when Amin was nearly caught out by a British officer. When his fellow African soldiers discovered his quick-wittedness upon being seen with a second woman in his barrack quarters, they began to call him Idi Amin Dada. On attainment of independence, Uganda's criminal code still technically regarded polygamy as a legal offense. British administrators and missionaries thought, though fully recognizing that polygamy was widely practiced, nevertheless maintained the myth on the statute books that bigamy was against the laws of Uganda. This anomaly survived nearly 10 years of independence because Obote's government did nothing to restore legitimacy to a widespread indigenous institution. But by July 1973, General Amin caught up with the anomaly, announcing the legislation of polygamy. Radio Uganda said it was intended to orient the attitude of Ugandans toward our cultural heritage and regain our self-respect and dignity. Our polygamous marriages would be contracted under the usual customary law and be in conformity with tribal regulations, including the payment of bride wealth. But there was protection for Christian and Muslim inhibitions. Man cannot have more than 1 wife if he had willingly opted for a Christian or civil marriage, and a Muslim marrying under Islamic law willingly had to limit himself to the 4 wives permitted under certain circumstances by the Prophet Muhammad. Apart from these concessions to the imported religions, the decree on polygamy restored an important element in the old warrior culture of the different indigenous societies. In the chat room, I see that Kevin K42 says that is with Denzel Washington. KW Don 7 says the movie was Mississippi Masala in 1991. Damn, I seem old. Brother, I'm there with you. Because I remember when it came out. Like I said, I remember as a kid watching Coming to America in the movie theaters when it came out. I too remember Mississippi Masala as well. Right? And I've always found it funny how not Denzel, but I guess I think that was a Spike Lee film too. I think so. I always remember how they tried to make the racist father, right, a sympathetic character because him and his family had to leave Uganda, I think it was, right, and go back to India. KW Don 7 also says that Idi Amin said he had to run the small hats out of Uganda to prevent it from going bankrupt. The small hats, I like that. He said he had to run the small house out of Uganda to prevent it from going bankrupt. Here's a funny thing. I'm going to use that term, the small hats. The small hats were run out of several European countries in history, right? For much the same reason. Several European countries for much the same reason, right? Even the means hostility to the Asians started in part as a reaction against their sexual and social exclusivity in Uganda. I was just about to say that about the small hats, right? His denunciation of the Asians first emphasized this exclusivity before he went on later to attack the economic preeminence of the community in Uganda. Only 6 Asians had ever married black people, claimed. Although there were many more Asians in Uganda than there were Europeans, mixed marriages involving Asians were rarer than those involving Europeans. If Mofolo is correct in that old assertion that, quote, above all else on earth, the black races love to marry, the barrier which the Asians of Uganda had erected against intermarriage with Africans was an important aspect of their tragic fate under General Idi Amin. As New Shaka was indeed as New Shaka has indeed cast a shadow across the African continent, but committed to virile masculinity rather than to celibate manliness, the sexual factor is itself symptomatic of something wider than that. What James Fernandez said of the Shaka complex is also true of the Amin phenomenon. I would suggest that we are much closer to important perceptions if we analyze the Shaka complex not in the terms of the problems of sexuality, but in terms of the problems of power. For it is this problem, if we can talk of a problem, that I feel to be more fundamental to African culture than the problem of sexuality. The Shaka complex is the drama of the working out of the impulse to power in human affairs. This brings us to the conclusion of the paper. As we get ready to conclude this paper, I want to thank all you guys who are here. I want to thank you guys in the chat room who have been participating. KW Don 7 says, Idi Amin also made any Urugu wanting to do business there bow before him and pay homage. Urugu made a propaganda program claiming Idi Amin was a cannibal. Yep. In fact, they even kind of touched on that in the film, right? The one where Forrest Whitaker, I think he won an award for that. They touched on that idea that he was some cannibal in that film. So here we are at the conclusion. In discussing the pressures of a black child growing up in the United States, 2 black psychiatrists examined the struggle against the forces of symbolic castration. For a white man in this country, the rudiments are settled at birth by the possession of a penis and a white skin. For the black man in this country, it's not so much a matter of acquiring manhood as it is a struggle to feel it is his own. Whereas the white man regards his manhood as an ordained right, the black man is engaged in a never-ending battle for its possession. For the black man, attaining any portion of manhood is an active process. He must penetrate barriers and overcome opposition in order to assume a masculine posture. For the inner psychological obstacles to manhood are never so formidable as the impediments even woven into American society. I have some thoughts about that statement that a lot of people won't like. In fact, I believe I touched on some of those thoughts back in the day when I did that episode on quote-unquote toxic masculinity. A friend of mine today sent me a video of a black woman. I wish I had it queued up. but it's on my phone. There's a black woman talking about, basically talking about what it is to be a black man and what are you supposed to do, and I respond to what you, but the energy is all off. The energy is all off in the discussion, right? In fact, let me see if I can pull it. No, I won't be able to pull it up here, right? But the energy is all off, and a part of that problem is that, and I know a lot of people ain't gonna like me for this, but a woman ain't supposed to tell you what is a man. A woman is not supposed to define and be able to tell you, well, if you was a real man, that's completely out of place. Because you can't go and tell a woman if you were a real woman. It's completely out of place. Maybe I'll do a show where I talk about my feelings about this stuff. Not read a paper, but just really get back into it. Maybe I do a part 2 to that old episode. In the case of the Black American, the impediments range from the multiple consequences of matriarchy as imposed by the slave experience to the shared problem of getting a job and supporting a family. But underlining it all is again the factor of the dependency complex, the political castration implicit in being dominated by another. The Black American, too, to the extent that he is now struggling to find a new basis for his manhood, might be experiencing the beginnings of a reawakened warrior heritage from his primeval past. Well, problem with that statement is these days, again, it's the old paper, but these days, I'm sorry to say it, but the BAs are not interested in any kind of African past, African warrior past, right? Many Black Americans have been enthusiastic over the warrior assertiveness of General Amin since 1972. Behind Amin lies a tradition which goes back to Shaka, the Zulu, and beyond, a tradition which has at times collapsed in exhaustion under the terrors of white hegemony, but which has also had its moments of resurrection. The Mau Mau was an important movement in such revival in the modern phase of African history, and provides a grand precedent for the liberation movements of Southern Africa. A warrior tradition, however, has also its brutal side. Both Shaka and Amin are among the most brutal of rulers in Africa's difficult history. Violence under the warrior tradition sometimes assumes a disproportionate air of sacredness and mystique. Manhood becomes equated with capacity for ruthlessness, as well as with potential for virility. The warrior tradition in Africa is far from being as yet dominant once again, but there are signs of an important resurrection. As a reaction and rebellion against dependency, this wears the face of proud promise. But as an initiation into the culture of violent valor, the resurrection of the warrior tradition in African political culture also carries its own special hazards. As Africa seeks to consolidate its manhood and recover its adulthood, it must also remember to conserve its humanity. And that's the paper for tonight. That is the paper for tonight. And by the way, if you guys ever want these papers, maybe you're doing your own research, maybe you want to read some of the references that are made in the paper that I don't always go into. Sometimes I do. You guys can hop on the Discord. I posted the link earlier. I'll post it again. Hop on the Discord. Ask me where can I get those papers? Right? Where can I get these papers that you're reading? And I'll give you all the papers that I have. I have a bunch of them. KW Dawn 7 says the cannibal of history, Urugu, projecting, claiming someone else is accountable. The irony. Well, like I always say, well, whatever they call you or call us as black folks is really them projecting themselves onto us, right? When they call you a savage, they call you that because they know that they are savages, right? When they worry about retaliation from black folks, they do that because they know to themselves, if it had happened to them, they'll be retaliated. So there's just a series of projections that these guys like to put down. But anyway, I don't see anything else in the comments. Let me just say to KW Don 7, I appreciate you, as you know. Thanks for coming through. Kevin Care 42 was in the room. I appreciate you. Make sure to check out also NYC Beauties, who was here tonight. NYC Beauties. Check out their YouTube channel. Gorgeous photography of gorgeous black women. Check it out. Who else was here? Black Excellence was here. Thanks to Black Excellence as well. Most of these folks I'm saying, who I'm hailing up and giving props to in the chat room, they're on the Discord already. If you're not on the Discord, make sure that you click the link, join today. We're also still working on the African Center curriculum. I know I don't talk about it as much because I decided kind of, sort of, just to move in silence for a minute and then drop some stuff on y'all at the appropriate time, right? Choose violence, right? Just drop it on you, heavy hitting, right? So that's coming up too. So if you want to join and help with the curriculum, by all means, click that link for the Discord, join the Discord server and ask, how can I help with the curriculum? If you're just a fan of the show, I got a few more subscribers recently. I got about 7 of you recently. Thank you for subscribing. If you just want to be a fan of the show, want to hop on and help with the show or discuss topics that we covered on the broadcast, by all means, join the Discord and come through. I usually don't do this too, but there's also the Cash App Bitter Meds, which is my same handle on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter as well. You guys feel free to cash out the show. Whatever proceeds you put, donate towards the show is either going to go to the show, making the show better, and I don't really have to do too much more with making the show any better. So it'll go towards the curriculum. So you guys can also cash out Bitter Meds and help us out. Lastly, make sure to check out the other shows on KWAZ Radio. Make sure to like and subscribe to KWAZ Radio's YouTube channel, as well as their Facebook page and their Twitter account. And they are on Instagram as well. So just like them across the board. Like everything that's coming out of KWAZ Radio. With that said, guys, I want to thank you again for joining me. I'll be back on. I should be back on for sure on Saturday. Can't think of anything else that'll keep me away from you guys. So make sure you guys come and tune in on Saturday. All right? Until then, peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.